The Paris Olympics has taken a controversial turn with a lot of criticism and furious reactions on social media from prominent global personalities.
There was never an intention to show disrespect
to any religious group.
The 2024 Paris Olympics have been fraught with controversies, casting a shadow over the global event. The opening ceremony, which featured drag queen-inspired portrayals of religious and historical figures, has sparked widespread criticism and debate. Political tensions also made their mark, with Palestinian supporters calling for a boycott of Israel and Russian and Belarusian teams being banned due to their nation's involvement in the Ukraine conflict. France's ban on female Muslim athletes wearing the hijab has been another flashpoint, igniting intense debate over religious freedom and inclusion. Amid the turmoil, Algerian boxer Imane Khalif captured gold, but her victory was overshadowed by a gender controversy that fueled further discussion. In a particularly unusual incident, Paraguayan swimmer Luana Alonso was reportedly sent home after claims surfaced that her stunning appearance was distracting her own teammates. A case that has raised eyebrows and added yet another layer of controversy to these tumultuous games. These issues echo the historical controversies that have often surrounded the Olympics, dating back to their ancient origins. The origins of the Olympics can be traced back to the 8th century BC in Olympia, located in the western Peloponnese. Olympia was a sacred site dedicated to Zeus. In 776 BC, during a religious ceremony, a sporting event known as the Stadion was held for the first time. The Stadion was a sprint of 600 classical feet, approximately 192 meters. Corybus, a cook from Elis, was the first winner, marking what is considered the first Olympic Games, even though it was primarily a religious event. Every 4 years, in honor of Zeus, Greek men competed in the Stadion during a period known as an Olympiad. In 724 BC, a second event called the Dialos was introduced, and in 708 BC, the pentathlon was added. The pentathlon included the long jump, javelin throw, discus throw, stadion, and wrestling. Other events were gradually included, such as the hoplitodromos, a race in armor, pygmachia, an early form of boxing, and pankration, a combination of wrestling and boxing. Chariot races were also introduced, held in the newly built hippodrome. These events were costly and often reserved for the wealthiest, who sometimes had slaves or employees compete on their behalf. Victory brought immense honor and rewards, including a crown of olive branches, statues in their honor, and numerous privileges in their home cities. In 632 BC, competitions for children were introduced, and by 580 BC, the Haraya Games, exclusively for women, were held 2 weeks after the men's games. These ancient Olympics continued until the rise of Christianity in the 4th century. In 392 AD, Emperor Theodosius III banned all pagan rites, effectively ending the Olympic Games. The site of Olympia was eventually abandoned, looted, and destroyed by earthquakes. It was forgotten until 1766 when an English archaeologist rediscovered it. After Greek independence, extensive excavations revived interest in the Olympic Games. Pierre de Coubertin, a Frenchman inspired by these discoveries, dreamed of reviving the Olympics. In 1894, he organized the first Olympic Congress in Paris, advocating for amateur sport and establishing the International Olympic Committee, IOC, to prepare for the modern Olympic Games. His initial dream was to hold the Games in Paris in 1900 during the Exposition Universelle, but the IOC decided to hold the first modern Olympic Games in Athens in 1896 instead. The Panathenaic Stadium, dating back to 330 BC, was renovated for the event. Over 10 days in April 1896, 14 countries competed in 43 events across athletics, gymnastics, wrestling, cycling, weightlifting, tennis, shooting, fencing, and swimming. Winners received silver medals, while second-place finishers received bronze and copper medals. Team events were also introduced, and the marathon, inspired by the legendary run of Pheidippides, made its debut. The Athens Games were a success, but the Paris 1900 Games, held during the Exposition Universelle, were overshadowed by the fair's other attractions. However, these games marked the first participation of women in the Olympics. The 1904 Games were held in St. Louis, USA, but were poorly attended due to the distance for many European athletes. The 1908 London Games were notable for their rapid organization and the inclusion of new nations. American athlete Raymond Urey, who had overcome polio, won multiple gold medals in these games. The 1912 Stockholm Games introduced artistic competitions in architecture, sculpture, literature, music, and painting. The marathon was marked by the mysterious disappearance of a Japanese runner, who later revealed he had taken a nap during the race and returned home in shame without giving any news. For the record, he returned to Stockholm in 1967 to finish his marathon in 54 years. The 1916 Berlin Games were canceled due to World War I, but the Olympics resumed in 1920 in Antwerp, Belgium. The Antwerp Games introduced the Olympic flag and oath and marked the return of many nations post-war. Pierre de Coubertin insisted on hosting the 1924 Games in Paris to redeem the disappointing 1900 Games. The 1924 Paris Games were followed by the first Winter Olympics in Chamonix, featuring events like bobsleigh, cross-country skiing, skating, curling, and ski jumping. The Winter Games were a success, setting the stage for their regular occurrence alongside the Summer Games. The 1928 Amsterdam Games saw the introduction of new women's events and the first lighting of the Olympic flame in the stadium. Germany returned to the Games after a 16-year absence, becoming the second most decorated nation behind the USA. The 1932 Los Angeles Games were held during the Great Depression, resulting in fewer participants but still showcased significant athletic achievements. The 1936 Berlin Games, orchestrated by Nazi Germany, were used for propaganda purposes. The budget for these games skyrocketed, and the country's youth were mandated to train for sports. Jews were excluded from sports organizations, leading to calls for a boycott. In response to international pressure, an alternative games were planned in Barcelona, but were canceled due to the Spanish Civil War. The Berlin Games saw the first torch relay from Olympia to the host city. Despite the political overtones, the Games were notable for Jesse Owens, an African-American athlete who won 4 gold medals, defying Nazi racial ideologies. World War II led to the cancellation of the 1940 and 1944 Olympics. The Games resumed in 1948 in London, held in a city still recovering from the war. Athletes brought their own food and equipment, staying in military camps and schools. The 1952 Helsinki Games featured the return of Germany and Japan, and the first participation of the USSR, marking the beginning of the Cold War Olympic rivalry. 2 separate Olympic villages were built for the Western and Soviet blocs. The 1956 Melbourne Games were the first held in the Southern Hemisphere, with equestrian events held separately in Stockholm due to Australian quarantine laws. The Suez Crisis and the Hungarian Revolt led to boycotts by several nations. The 1960 Rome Games were the first to be televised live across Europe. Cassius Clay, later known as Muhammad Ali, won the light heavyweight boxing gold medal, launching his legendary career. The Rome Games also hosted the first Paralympic Games for athletes with disabilities. The 1964 Tokyo Games were the first in Asia, featuring the participation of many newly independent African nations. Apartheid South Africa was excluded. The 1968 Mexico City Games were marked by student protests and a government massacre just before the Games. Despite the political unrest, many world records were broken due to the high altitude of the city. The 1972 Munich Games were marred by the tragic terrorist attack that resulted in the death of 11 Israeli athletes. The Games continued, but under a somber atmosphere. The 1976 Montreal Games faced financial issues and boycotts by African nations, protesting New Zealand's participation after its rugby team toured apartheid South Africa. The 1980 Moscow Games were boycotted by 65 nations in protest of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In retaliation, the Soviet Union led a boycott of the 1984 Los Angeles Games. Despite the political backdrop, the Los Angeles Games were financially successful due to commercial sponsorships. The 1988 Seoul Games were marked by North Korea's boycott and South Korea's democratic reforms under pressure from its citizens. The end of the Cold War brought a less politicized atmosphere to the Olympics. The 1992 Barcelona Games saw the participation of a unified team of former Soviet states, a reunited German team, and South Africa's return with a mixed delegation. The inclusion of NBA stars like the USA's Dream Team in basketball was a highlight. The 1996 Atlanta Games, celebrating the centenary of the modern Olympics, were overshadowed by a bomb attack but were notable for the commercial success and widespread participation. The 2000 Sydney Games focused on reconciliation with Indigenous Australians, with Cathy Freeman becoming a national hero by winning the 400 meters. The 2004 Athens Games saw significant financial overreach, impacting Greece's economy, but were a homecoming for the Olympics. The 2008 Beijing Games showcased China's rising global influence, with the Olympic flame traveling across all continents despite protests. Michael Phelps became a global sensation, winning 8 gold medals. The 2012 London Games were historic for achieving gender parity among participants and the first-time participation of women from every country. The 2016 Rio de Janeiro Games featured the first Olympic team for refugees, highlighting global humanitarian issues. The Tokyo 2020 Games, postponed to 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, were held without spectators, significantly affecting the budget. Russian athletes competed under a neutral banner due to doping allegations. The Paris 2024 Olympics have begun, making history with perfect gender parity and the introduction of breakdancing. The Paris 2024 Olympics are drawing to a close, leaving a legacy of groundbreaking achievements and significant milestones. This edition of the Games, which made history with its perfect gender parity and the debut of breakdancing as an official sport, has set a new standard for inclusivity and innovation.